Great. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the IHR Food History Seminar, and welcome to everyone catching up on this afterwards. We're lucky today to have Adrienne Bitar talking to us. Adrienne is a lecturer in American Studies at Cornell University. She's a specialist in the history and culture of American food and health. Her first book, The Diet and the Disease of Civilization, was published in 2018 with Rutgers University Press. It explored the way that dieting systems responded to anxieties about the psychic and physical costs of modernity in the 20th century. And Adrienne's working on a new project at the moment about lab-grown meat and meat analogues, which is the subject of her talk today. So off you go, Adrienne. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Charlie. It's really a pleasure to be part of this inspirational seminar and to be speaking to such a well-read and diverse group of food scholars, and this is a great community to present to. So I very much welcome your thoughts and suggestions for sources as we move forward with this presentation. So I'll start by sharing my screen, and you can see it. So the topic for today's talk is an American history of meat substitutes and analogs. And as we were just discussing before the seminar began, this is a really wonderful community to present this work to. And I'm very interested in hearing everyone's perspectives. So before we get into the history, let's lay out the contemporary landscape. So where are we now in 2022 with meat substitutes and analogs? I know I'm speaking to a diverse international audience, so maybe some of these products wouldn't be so familiar to you, but to an American audience, these have become nearly commonplace. Plant-based meat products have become widely available. And we're not talking the black bean burgers from Morningstar Farms that are shelved in the frozen food aisle. We're thinking about sort of next generation high-tech products that are using genetic modification and other sophisticated culinary techniques to create products that look, act, feel, and in some cases bleed like meat, like true animal meat. So you see here on the top left, and actually, just as this is out of curiosity, if you could put a thumbs up in your square if you've either encountered these products before or perhaps tried them. That'll give you some basis for, okay, so a handful. Okay, I'd say about half. So these products, for most reviewers, most sort of culinary experts, say that they're pretty darn close to animal meat. This is the Impossible Whopper, which was introduced to Burger King in 2019, 100% Whopper, 0% beef. Starbucks followed suit in 2020, introducing their vegan breakfast sandwich, which used Impossible sausage. And now these products, as you can see on the top right and then below it, are really packaged and sold like meat in supermarkets and big box stores and restaurants across the country and the globe. The real potential in this field, the real sort of exciting frontier, to use that language, lies, sure, in plant-based meat, but this new category, which is lab-grown and cultured meat. And especially to this audience, I'm sure you're well aware of the hype, the promise, the potential of these products. Now this, just to be clear, is actual, you could call it actually meat, and there's a whole host of ethical and sort of, complex linguistic turns of phrases that we have to sort of grapple with, but it's products that are actually made from animal cells, but rather having those animal cells grow inside the animal and lead to slaughter. Scientists are harvesting these cells normally through sort of a harmless biopsy and growing these cells in a lab, in a vat, what they call a carnery, sort of like a brewery, if you're familiar with microbrewing, and then bringing them to market. So Singapore in December 2020, so just about a year and a half ago, was the first to approve the sale of cultured meat in restaurants in their country. In the United States today, we're facing a whole host of regulatory issues. Who should regulate this product? Is it animal? Is it vegetable? Is it safe to eat? What kind of regulation should it encounter, or will it encounter? Is it affordable? Is it scalable? Will it actually be on our plates in the next 10 years? So if you're familiar with the news media cycle about cultured or lab grown meat, you'll be aware that every I don't know, every 6 months they'll say, okay, we're going, it's on the horizon. It's almost on our dinner tables, in 6 months, in 12 months, in 18 months, but that date has been pushed back because there's a lot of technological obstacles to overcome. But today in 2022, we have a wide array of plant-based meat options available in fast food restaurants, in big box stores, and pretty soon we should be encountering cultured meat in our marketplace. And all of this innovation has generated not just media hype, but big money. So the Good Food Institute, which is the sort of nonprofit group promoting these products and other animal-free proteins, just released its numbers for 2021, and they found that there was a record 5 billion with a B, invested in alternative proteins in 2021, surging something like 60% since 2020. And that money was parceled out like this. Plant-based was about 2 billion, and then cultured raised another $1.4 billion. So this is big money, big venture capital behind these endeavors. The remaining was fermentation, which is another novel technological technique to produce animal proteins. Just last month, in April 2022, Upside Foods, which is a San Francisco Bay Area company, I saw someone who's zooming in from San Francisco, raised an additional $400 million to build out a cultured meat food processing facility in Emeryville, which is between Oakland and Berkeley and San Francisco Bay Area. This is very much in the Silicon Valley world. And I want to make this point clear. Their goal is 100% market share. They're not interested in capturing the 8% of Americans, roughly 6 to 8%, the numbers vary, of Americans who identify as vegetarians. And they're definitely not interested in capturing the world's vegetarians who may be vegetarians out of necessity or for religious beliefs. Their goal is to have a 100% market share. They want to herald the end of animal farming, to replace animals as vehicles for meat production, just like we replaced, I borrow from Paul Shapiro's work here, we replace horses for transportations or whale for oil. Thinking that, maybe in 100 years, we'll look at a cow, just like we look at a horse today, sort of an amusement or sort of for decoration or for ornament, not as a vehicle for the horse's case, transportation, or the cow's case, beef. 100% market share. So these are big goals, lofty ambitions here, and we can see big money supporting it. So why now? Why, especially in the last year, has this become such a groundswell of support? Well, as we were chatting about before the talk started, there's a growing awareness about the dangers of animal agriculture. And there's a growing awareness about how meat is maybe no longer tenable part of our diet. Probably you're all well aware that the environmental consequences of animal agriculture are enormous. When you're thinking about climate change prevention measures, livestock are responsible for something like 15% of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. There's also the public health component. It's 2022, but we're still living with the pandemic. Animal agriculture poses a high pandemic risk based on deforestation and a host of other reasons. Also, the antibiotic use is a coming crisis that deserves our attention. That the largest consumers of antibiotics in the United States are not sick humans, but healthy animals, healthy farmed animals, where antibiotics are given preventatively, because the disease risk is so high in some of these factory farms. And third, there's this animal welfare component, which is unchanging since the origins of vegetarianism, but more and more people are getting concerned that the factory farming method and model is unduly cruel to our farm animals or farmed animals, however you want to put it. And at the same time that there's this growing awareness about the dangers of animal agriculture, there's new research and development, which is showing us that these products, these realistic meat analogs for the plant-based side of things, are viable alternatives. So plant-based products like Impossible Foods use genetic modification to produce heme, which is their special sauce. I had the privilege of touring the Impossible factory back in 2018, and I tasted heme, and it tasted like you just got a fist to the face, because it actually tasted like blood. And it's produced through genetic modification. It kind of gives it the real bloody taste. And on the cultured side of things, there's enormous leaps and bounds by making these products not just scalable, but also affordable. So if you're familiar with Mark Post's work, that was about 10 years ago that he debuted the first lab-grown hamburger, but that lab-grown hamburger cost to the tune of $250,000 to $500,000. Today, we're getting to price points that are much more reasonable to an average consumer. Not spending, $500,000 on lunch seems a little bit more reachable. So the nutrient media is becoming more available. The cell source material is moving towards vegan alternatives, and then scaffolding. So if you follow this food science conversation at all, you'll be aware that when people are heralding the beginnings of cultured meat, they're talking about like chicken nuggets and ground beef. They're not talking about meat with structure, with striation, with a real like a T-bone steak or a chicken breast. It's much more technologically difficult than to create sort of like a slurry of meat cells that can be molded into a patty or a nugget. So these technological achievements are growing in leaps and bounds. Yet, so is that the end of the story? Is this the end of animal agriculture? Well, the short answer is no. I think there's two major obstacles to the 100% market share goal. The first is that government investment has lagged behind. There's been a lot of venture capital, and there's a lot of been private interests heavily invested in this, whether for ideological or for business reasons, but government investment has lagged behind. And I will make the argument that meat eating in the United States in particular is gendered and politicized, and that has prevented the government from putting their money where their mouth is, because this is a costly endeavor to produce these new technologies. The second big obstacle is you can lead a horse to water, but can you make it drink? Not so easy. That consumers are reluctant to try these foods, especially lab-grown meat. Some consumers call them frankenfoods or zombie foods. They say it's unnatural, which is a particularly nasty epithet when you're talking about food. They ask, well, are these new technologies mankind's ultimate hubris? When scientists create life in a petri dish, are we playing God? Consumer acceptance studies have borne this out in 2014, so we're looking about 10 years ago at this point. Far more Americans indicated their willingness to ride in a driverless car, which has been known to be lethal, than eat lab-grown meat. And then a more recent study showed that only 1/3 of American consumers indicated their willingness to purchase meats based on ingredients produced artificially. So a real minority of American consumers are saying, well, even if this product is available and it's safer, cheaper, cleaner, healthier even than regular meat, I still may not be willing to try it. There also another part of this story about consumer acceptance is that I believe that eating is essentially a conservative act. Psychologists have called this conservatism the omnivore's dilemma, which is the title of a Michael Pollan book you may be familiar with, or the moral quandary that we omnivores face when determining the difference between food and poison. So unlike koalas content with eucalyptus, we humans have long faced life and death decisions about our new foods with every bite. There's also a blind spot with these Silicon Valley companies that they're representing their foods as new and different. And that's distinct from many of the values venerated by foodie culture today. So foodies today venerate natural, organic, local, and simple foods largely. And you can see, for example, in restaurant traditions, lauding tradition in dishes named after like peasant cooks and heirloom tomatoes and their grandmother's secret recipes. So if eating is a conservative act undergirded by fear, it makes a lot of sense why consumers are reluctant to ingest unnatural alternative meats. But most important, consumers may also fear meat analogues because history has failed to tell the right story. And that takes us to my contribution about meatless meats in the United States. For hundreds of years, world leaders have dreamed of a meaty, meatless, high-protein diet that was safe, efficient, and humane. Lab-grown and plant-based meats today are simply realizing a very old dream of a world free of slaughter, but rich with protein. In fact, business leaders, politicians, and heads of military sought out viable meat substitutes for the same practical, not ideological necessarily, same practical reasons motivating the search for meat analogs today: efficiency, sustainability, safety, and cost. And you see here I'm omitting health because safety and health are very different when we're talking about meat production. So today I'll spend the bulk of my time showing how the history of meatless meats in both branded food history and commercial products like Protos and John Harvey and Harvey Kellogg, World War I with Hoover's efforts at food conservation, World War II with Margaret Mead's work, show us how, if we do this right, and if this is played the right way, we may now be quickly realizing this dream of an efficient, ethical, safe, and sustainable animal-free, slaughter-free future. So why is this? Why? You have to ask, why has meat eating become so gendered and politicized? Why has the government been so reluctant to invest? And why are consumers still reluctant to accept these products? I think it's because this history, the history of meat substitutes, has largely been ignored, obscured, or forgotten, and obscured by the history of vegetarianism. For the government side of things, the meat has become gendered and politicized in the United States. And this has a long and rich scholarship in the food studies world. Here you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, 2 screenshots from a Fox News television program. And Fox, as you probably are well aware, is a conservative, very conservative channel. Having a sensationalist headline that Biden, in the wake of Biden's climate change plan, was going to start rationing red meat because of the outsized environmental impact of meat. There was threats that he was going to cut 90% of our red meat, and every American was going to be limited to simply 1 burger per month. This was a ludicrous statement, made all the more ludicrous by the fact that Americans eat something along the lines of 200 pounds of red meat a year. Yet the controversy was there. It shows how in our world today that there's a contemporary partisan and gendered politics of meat eating. There's these conservative conspiracy theories saying that, Trump is a red meat Republican, but Biden is this sort of, kind of wimpy, effeminate, someone who was sort of sympathetic to the vegetarian cause. And this you can see in other sort of political discourse. For example, Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City, just introduced a vegan diet 1 day a week for New York City school children. That faced a lot of resistance from conservatives in the area. Biden was called the hamburglar, as a sort of funny turn of phrase. But why has it become so gendered and politicized in the United States? Well, the first answer is that lobbies like the American Cattlemen Association has had an outsized influence in DC, but also point to like the romance of the American West, the idea that the cowboy is king. And even if, and it's definitely the case, the way we raise our animals in the United States today is a far distant cry from the open frontier of cowboy lore. There's this sense that the frontier represents something vital and deep-seated and important about American values, looking back at Frederick Jackson Turner's famous frontier thesis. And the cowboy represents when men were men and we all had the freedom to move. And there's something really sort of romantic and resonant about this story about cowboys in the American West. There also is this history of vegetarianism, which obscures the history of development of meat substitutes. So because we have this gendered and politicized and sort of cacophony of discussions about vegetarianism, it has obscured or overcast the development of meat substitute, which is a much more sober story, a little bit less interesting, but a lot more sort of impactful if you think about the goals that meat companies have today. So the history of vegetarianism will be the first part of this talk. We'll look at Sylvester Graham, John Harvey Kellogg, and more briefly, the 60s and 70s countercultures that looked towards a vegetable diet or vegetarianism, and they were ethically or ideologically motivated. And they were very much opposed to government investment. This was the counterculture, or to borrow Warren Blasco's term, this was the counter cuisine. Yet the history of meat substitutes is far more sober. And it was the reason why that meat substitutes have been developed in the past are for much of the same reasons that meat substitutes are being developed now, for reasons of cost, efficiency, national security, safety, sustainability, and public health. And this is in line with government investment. Yet investing in meat substitutes, because it has this sort of taint, or political taint of vegetarianism, has become politically unpalatable. Although there was a recent investment into Tufts Institute for Cellular Agriculture, I think it was $10 million, which is a drop in the bucket, but might signal a growing interest into the field. So let's start with this history of vegetarianism, and the history of vegetarian meat substitutes. Here you see Sylvester Graham's 1837, a treatise on bread making. American vegetarianism began at the tail end of the 18th century, although the term wouldn't be coined until the 1840s. And they practiced the vegetable diet as a way of life, often united by religious principles. Early communes practiced vegetarianism alongside free love and common property. And vegetarianism, in the words of one scholar, was integral to a radical critique of social, economic, gendered, and racial structures. This was not just a simple diet. This draws on my earlier work on diet for weight loss, but there's no such thing as a simple diet. Diets are always accompanied by political visions, by moral reform, by sense of community, and this clearly was just the diet was just part and parcel of this radical critique. Sylvester Graham was born in 1794 and he died in 1851. He's known today for his namesake, graham cracker. And he promoted the vegetable diet alongside temperance and sexual restraint. He believed that meat was a stimulant that excited a heathenish lust for sex and defied the principles of the Bible. He thought people needed to eat Adam and Eve's diet in the Garden of Eden, as he defined it, as fruits, nuts, farinaceous seeds, and roots, with perhaps some milk and it may be honey. Opponents guffawed at Graham's philosophy, and the slavish Grahamites, they called Graham's followers, even as they feared the political power of these Grahamites. Here you see a quote from the president of Amherst College saying that Grahamites were not only reformers in diet, but radicalists in politics, troubled by slavery, colonization, etc. I like that quote because the etc. is so loaded. What could that etc. actually mean? So he's pointing out here that this wasn't just a diet. In fact, the diet could be sort of the gateway drug into these dangerous political ideas. I want to remind you, this is the origin for why maybe government investment in meat substitutes today would be politically sort of unfavorable and very partisan. So Graham's nickname earned him, Graham's diet earned him the nickname of Dr. Sawdust. And it wasn't just, college presidents, but also medical journals. They regularly took offense and ran screeds against how absurd these notions were. They cast Grahamites and other vegetarians as wretched, mendacious quacks, full of vanity, superstition, and roguery, showing that even at the time that people understood that vegetarianism was not just simply a diet, but rather sort of part and parcel of a whole sort of political worldview. And Graham believed that all meat, both nutritionally and culturally, was unnecessary for a healthy diet. He advocated for a no meat diet, full stop, although his followers later transitioned to meat substitutes and analogs. So the distinction here is subtle but important. I'm going to dwell on it. That Graham believed that the evils and nutritional qualities of meat were entirely unnecessary. He believed that people could thrive on a diet of bread and vegetables and fruits and nuts. But some of his followers, picking up on the newer science of nutrition, thought a healthy diet required the nutritional contribution of meat, but foods like nuts and beans could supply those nutrients. So where are they getting that information from? In 1894, the United States Department of Agriculture, here you can see, sponsored Wilbur Waters' research into the nutritive value and cost of foods. He was the original head of the research at USDA, and he published the first composition table of food values. So here you can see proteins. Oh, actually, I can do that. Here you can see proteins, fats, carbohydrates, and what he calls fuel value, which we would call calories in our contemporary English. By abstracting the qualities of meat out into specific elements like proteins and fats shared with other foods like cornmeal you can see here, or beans, Atwater's research legitimated products as nutritionally equal to meat. So they asked themselves this question: if a person simply needed 10 grams of protein, what did it matter if he obtained that protein from a banana or a beefsteak. So you see here, he was very concerned with what he called the pecuniary economy of food, or bang for your buck. So with 25 cents of purchasing power, here 25 cents, what is the most sort of cost-effective way of obtaining fuel value, calories, proteins, fats, and carbohydrates? And he found that beef was actually came up lacking. So if you were on a budget, which many, especially when food composed a far higher percentage of the average American family budget, and he was very concerned with the rapidly developing rural South. He said, well, actually, if we just want proteins, fats, carbohydrates, and fuel value, it makes a lot more sense to be purchasing your cornmeal or beans or peas for your money than purchasing, these 3 cuts of beef. And discoveries like these fueled a distinct historical turning point, away from a diet that rejected meat altogether, like Graham, to one that used the principles of substitution to incorporate nutrients often supplied by meat. And that takes us to Protos and John Harvey Kellogg. So John Harvey Kellogg, similarly long-lived. He was born in 1852 and died in 1943. His wife, 1853 to 1920, really pioneered the first commercial meat substitute. And they used Atwater's research to create what they called, there was many actually, there was many meat substitutes, there was about 9, but we're going to focus today on Protos, which was the vegetable meat. It was nationally available by the 1890s. He was inspired by Graham's work, but he transitioned away from his absolutist vegetarianism because he believed that meat nutrients could be necessary for a healthy diet, even if meat was abominable. So the proteins and the fats supplied by meat could be healthy, even if the meat itself should be rejected as disgusting and barbaric. Kellogg was a trained medical doctor, well-versed in this sort of new science of nutrition. He was the founder of the Battle Creek Sanitarium in Michigan. He treated his patients not only with a strict, bland vegetarian diet, but as you're probably well aware, he's a very colorful figure in the history of food in the United States, but bizarre regimens of sunbaths, enemas, and vibrations. Critics, like the critics of Graham, derided him as a crank and a quack. And like Graham, he was motivated by religious purity, arguing that the massacre of farm animals and the consumption of these trusted friends desecrated the human body. He may have been an eccentric crank, but he was enormously successful, and the likes of Warren G. Harding, Amelia Earhart, Thomas Edison, and Sojourner Truth all were treated by Kellogg at the sanitarium. And profits from that sanitarium funneled into both the Kellogg's, Allie Eaton Kellogg and John Harvey Kellogg's numerous food laboratories, where he tinkered with high protein ingredients like the flaking and processes like the flaking process that we inspired today's cornflakes. So more than Graham or other food reformers before him, Kellogg understood the power of business. In Kellogg's time, food reform was this chaotic mix of hucksters, dieters, vegetarians, fattists, and health food companies. I'll remind you, this is the 1890s. This was the sort of heat of the Industrial Revolution. It was marked by mass market technologies and growing expendable income and health consciousness. Also, the innovations of the revolution fostered technological optimism. Kellogg harnessed this early consumer culture and mass marketing to make room for meat analogs in this booming consumer marketplace. And he also was not just interested in converting the vegetarians. He was interested in this 100% market share goal. He and his wife, Ellie Eaton Kellogg, first promoted nuts, not simply as a, and I quote, vegetable analog of meat, but a more perfect nutrient than meat. And then soon after, the Assistant Secretary of the USDA named Charles Dabney asked the Kellogg's to create meat substitutes for all Americans, not just vegetarians. Dabney was, and I quote from Adam Sprinson's work, consumed with finding ways to make cheap and abundant food products, especially given the rising prices of meat at the time and the potential for shortage in the rapidly developing rural South. And this is a concern we see echoed today with inflation in the United States, especially affecting meat prices. In a letter to Kellogg, Dabney expressed desire, and I quote, a scientifically prepared plant product affording all the essential nutrient qualities of beef or mutton. And Dabney was particularly interested in feeding people who were chronically malnourished in the very rural parts of the Deep South. Emphasizing efficiency, they agreed it was foolish to feed grain to animals when the grain could be consumed by humans directly. This is a concern that we see echoed in the 1970s, and it's very resonant with today's work. Dabney believed meat substitutes could be efficient, more efficient, less resource intensive, and support a growing population. Soon, Kellogg was selling hugely popular vegetable meats that mimicked the taste and texture of meat. There's Nattose and Protose. They were sold as more nutritious, palatable, and digestible than meat. What were these products, you might ask? They were high protein combinations of peanuts, crushed peanuts or peanut butter, wheat gluten, and cereal grains, and apparently had a gelatinous consistency similar to a brick of cheese. Adam Sprinson found that by 1912, Protose was widely available with shipments of more than 144,000 pounds. So this was not just like a bizarre niche product, but really did reach a broad audience. You can see here also the term vegetarian meat was trademarked in 1905. It had a great deal of mass market appeal in light of the following year of Upton Sinclair's expose, The Jungle. Let's look at an advertisement for Protose. He understood that it wasn't just the proteins, the fats, the carbohydrates of Atwater's work, that cornmeal and beans, even if it did supply the right amount of nutrients, the same macronutrient profile, it needed to sort of capitalize on the prestige value of beef, showing that meat and strength were intimately intertwined, that the growing boy or girl, the laborer, all who indulge in vigorous exercise need an extra measure of protein. With a few cans of Protose, the protein part of your daily bill of fare is assured. He also understood that meat was a symbol of progress, especially in the United States. The streets weren't paved with gold, they were paved with stakes. That the Protose was touted not only widely known, but manufactured and used in the leading civilized country in the world. Here you can see an advertisement that this is a truly wonderful food product, the most remarkable discovery. And I love this term of phrase here, it is original beef. So it's both more natural than beef, but also this sort of extraordinary technological achievement. It is a perfect substitute for flesh food and is absolutely, or almost absolutely identical in composition, appearance, and flavor. So you see here that he's really pushing this food as both being nutritionally equivalent, that it also fulfilled the sort of cultural responsibilities of the cultural role that beef played in the American diet at the time. These products were not without their controversies. Here you can see ethical vegetarianism is really coming down on both Kellogg's products, which you can see in the literature, and also just in general, the idea that you could be eating something that resembled, that tasted like meat. So you can see here in 1912, a cookbook saying that you shouldn't eat anything that looked like meat, even if it was technically made from meat, nuts, and gluten. She's saying, it will be found lacking from the index such dishes as vegetarian hamburg steak or pigeon pie because they repel rather than attract, bringing to mind scorched carcasses. So even if these products weren't actually made from animal products, even they were resonant, they brought to mind the idea of a scorched carcass, and that was repugnant and disgusting and barbaric. Rather, she offered recipes for foods that gave vegetarian cuisine their sort of bad reputation, for things like lettuce sandwiches or nut sandwiches, which is take a lettuce leaf, put it on a piece of bread with some butter and spread with plain or green mayonnaise. So these were sort of proudly vegetarian recipes that didn't even purport to imitate something that resembled a scorched carcass or an animal product. So all of this chaos and conflict and misappropriation of science crowded out more even-keeled approaches to meat substitutes. In response to colorful characters like Kellogg, Meat Analogues at this time was painted as the province of snake oil salesmen, quacks, cranks, and fattists with wacky ideas about human nutrition. And the 1960s and 1970s didn't help. There was a resurgence in interest in sort of DIY or do-it-yourself meat substitutes in the 60s and 70s in the light of Diet for a Small Planet, which I'm sure you're all well aware of. It was published in 1971. Here we have Bun's Steers, published in 1975, very countercultural, counter cuisine. How and why to make your own delicious high protein mock meats, fake fish, dairyless desserts. So further aligning and cementing meat substitutes with this sort of countercultural, eccentric, quacky, cranky, all of this sort of, bizarre, the sort of bizarro characters in American food history. history of meat substitutes is very different from the history of these meat analogues. So meat in American military history, we were chatting about before, has a lot to offer, sort of more sober discussion about how these products were developed. Some of the most important leaps in meat technology were born from the dire necessity of war. In the Civil War, the American Civil War, the Salisbury steak was created when James Salisbury created a chipped beef dish to fight the ravages of tuberculosis. And this is the topic of Kelly Spring's work too. Without World War II, we wouldn't have Spam as a mainstay of Hawaiian cuisine. And throughout American military history, or global military history, meat is the biggest prize of all. It boosted morale and provided high energy nutrition for traveling troops. As one food technologist put it, quote, meat, being a morale builder, has played a central role in almost all military-oriented food research. However, meat is expensive, inefficient, and liable to rot. And sources from other sides bear out these objections. One 1921 article from the military surgeon instructed American medical officers how to cut through layers of decayed beef. And I quote, dry mold is harmless. The author reassures his reader, slime is the thing to prevent. He continues by promising a saving of 60 to 70% on even badly slimed beef. And American military history is riddled with accounts of these non-existent or badly slimed beef. During the Revolutionary War, there's accounts of soldiers saying, no meat, an echo of the calls of crows and the owl. George Washington insisted that cattle be kept in large quantities to be kept in our rear because it's so inefficient. And even when meat was provided, the historical record is rich with soldiers' complaints. During the Civil War, even Horsford, better known today as the inventor of baking soda, created this biscuit of parched beef. Inspired by horse feed, he called his biscuit, quote, marvelously compact and light marching ration of compressed beef and parched wheat grits. Troops rejected these rations outright. A few decades later, the embalmed beef scandal characterized the corrupting powers of the big business. Some 200,000 tons of refrigerated and canned meat shipped to Cuba in 1898 were tainted. Observers claimed that 7 times as many men died from defective meat as they did combat, which is an extraordinary statistic. Later, a poet said his ration of beef contained a putridity of odor more pungent than ever reaches the nostrils for a properly embalmed cadaver. Today, in our perspective, we can only imagine how putrid, slimed, moldy meats must have tasted. But by the start of World War I, the American military was beginning to understand that animal meat was dangerous, expensive, perishable, and inefficient. And that brings us to World War I. As the nation's food czar, the director of the United States Food Administration, Hoover was the first to truly understand that meat substitutes were key to the war effort. There's a chat, yeah. He was charged with feeding both Americans and the millions of hungry civilian allies. Over his career, Hoover saved millions from starvation in war-torn Belgium and later Russia. And some historians, this is another extraordinary statistic, some historians now believe that Hoover saved more lives than any person that has ever lived based on his starvation prevention measures. And meat substitutes were central to this plan. He chose not to ration, even though the powers of the Lever Act afforded him that ability. Instead, he relied on propaganda and research to decrease meat consumption and encourage conservation. He issued the United States Secretary of Agriculture issued a recipe book touting soybean mush croquettes and meatloaf as protein-rich substitute. And here you can see, for example, a recipe for imitation veal loaf that used, put out by the United States Secretary of Agriculture, that used ground nuts and breadcrumbs and various spices to create something that imitated to be veal loaf. He also pushed Meatless Tuesdays, and although there was interest in health promoting foods after the discovery of vitamins or vitamania in the 19-teens, Hoover was reluctant to appeal to good health to promote this diet. In letters to President Wilson, Hoover intimated that he wanted to distinguish himself from fattists like Kellogg, saying that this wasn't health promoting, we weren't aligned with these eccentric vegetarians, but rather this was pure substitutability. For Americans to trust that beans could replace beef, the public needed to believe in pure nutritional substitution. Beans were no better, no worse, but exactly the same as beef. So the United States Department of Agriculture used substitutability to develop things like Victory bread and other products based on scientific nutrition. So here you can see a poster put out by the Arizona Council of Defense that also pushed for environmental reasons to conserve, which is interesting in light of 2022 concerns about climate change. This 1914 poster asks the American people, do you know beans make an excellent substitute for meat? Can be grown with comparatively little irrigation, improve the soil, are a staple crop easily stored. So what's missing from this kind of rhetoric is any health claims. That posters like these appeal to Americans supporting the war effort while convincing them that the food values or meat values of their diet would remain exactly the same. World War food reform was also decidedly practical. So you see here they were interested in stretchers as well as substitutes of foods that could stretch meat to go farther. And then in one sort of bizarre moment of American history, there was a 1918 whale steak luncheon. They backed alternative meats like shark and rabbit and staged a public dinner to urge the use of whale meat as a substitute for lamb, beef, or pork, rebranding whale as sea steak and porpoise as sea beef. Here is the cover of the menu. What happened in World War II was slightly different, as rationing was in place, but still there was an effort to lead to similar innovations. Much like when World War I, food reform in World War II was flexible, encouraging Americans to eat less desirable cuts of meats or extend or stretch their meats with grains or legumes. The Department of Defense asked the National Research Council to study American foodways. Soon, Margaret Mead, the famous anthropologist, and a host of other prominent social scientists made up the Committee on Food Habits. From their research, they began pushing organ meats into the American diet. Low status offal was a hard sell, but researchers began filling sausage casings with brain and kidneys and liver in army mess halls. Researchers insisted that offal was exciting and provided variety to a dull menu of beef, pork, and chicken, giving us the term variety meats that we still use today. So here you see an image put out by that committee of braised hearts, and here is an effort to stretch our meat. So here is a cup of dried lima beans supplemented with a quarter cup of meat drippings, sort of like the reducitarian diet today. This recipe also pushed for meat analogues, even if it called for some meat. This one is for lima burgers. The author said lima burgers look like meat couplets, but there's not even a scrap of meat in them, which is not how we would call meat today because there's a quarter cup of meat drippings, but that's a different story. And she assured home cooks that peanuts and cheese sauce add to the protein value of the dish. So where does that leave us in 2022? Looking at the history of World War I, World War II, and these commercially branded substitutes that came out of history of vegetarianism. Well, from my perspective, I see a lot of opportunity. When we peel away the ideological battles of vegetarians, history shows us a very different picture of the measured, rational quest for meat substitutes. Meat substitutes have never been simply the province of sexual radicals and religious reformers. They have been, and still are, critical to national defense and resource conservation. Yet the historical particulars of meat substitutes have sort of overridden or overshadowed this story. Dogmatists like Graham and Kellogg painted these substitutes as the province of eccentrics and cranks and quacks. The history shows us the public accepted meat substitutes when prominent leaders used the science of nutrition to claim substitutes were nutritionally equivalent to meat. Instead of health claims, leaders appealed to patriotism to push for widespread acceptance. And to a lesser extent, Hoover and later the Committee on Food Habits praised the environmental and cost benefits of sustainable, thrifty foods like eggs and beans. Today, I see an opportunity to move beyond these traditional substitutes to harness 21st century technology to create palatable, sustainable, practical, and affordable substitutes, and also to move beyond this overblown rhetoric pitched by Silicon Valley startups and consider more incremental practical changes and alternatives that we saw in the world wars. Because meat analogues today find themselves heirs to this complex and challenging legacy laid by Kellogg and Hoover. Lab-grown and plant-based meats at once portray themselves as natural and new, safe, but nutritionally equivalent to meat. And history has much to teach us about today's plant-grown and lab-based analogues. Kellogg and Graham might be dismissed as irrelevant vegetarian fanatics, but their products fundamentally shaped the development of meat analogs today. World War I, World War II meat substitutes might also be dismissed as temporary responses to world food crises, but they also proved that wary omnivores would accept, maybe even embrace meat substitutes if the pitch was right. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions and comments.